Can we sleep in your barn? Those 6 words would shatter a hardened rancher's carefully built walls and resurrect a heart he'd buried alongside his wife and child. Silas Gentry thought he'd found safety in solitude, but when a desperate young woman and 2 freezing children appeared at his barn door on that bitter Montana night in 1883, he faced a choice that would define the rest of his life. Stay with me until the end and comment your city so I can see how far this story travels. The wind that evening carried more than snow across the Montana Territory. It carried the weight of decisions, yet unmade, of lives hanging in a balance as delicate as frost on a window pane. Silas Gentry had learned to read the wind the way other men read newspapers, and what he heard in its howl as dusk settled over his ranch told him trouble was coming. He just didn't know it would arrive on 2 small feet wrapped in rags and be accompanied by the most haunting question he'd heard in 5 years. The ranch sat in a valley cupped by hills that rolled like frozen waves toward the horizon, their peaks dusted white even in early autumn. It was October 1883, and the territory was still raw, still finding its shape the way a river finds its course, through persistence and the wearing down of resistance. Silas's spread wasn't the biggest in the region, but it was substantial enough: 200 acres of grazing land, a sturdy barn built from timber he'd cut himself, and a house that had once held laughter, but now echoed with nothing but his own footsteps and the accusations that plagued his quiet hours. He was checking the barn's western wall where the wind liked to find gaps when he heard it. A sound so soft it might have been a branch scraping wood, except there were no trees close enough. Then it came again, more insistent: knock, knock, knock. 3 careful raps, almost apologetic in their timidity. Silas's hand moved instinctively to the rifle leaning against the feed bin. Rustlers had been working the valley for months, bold enough now to strike before full dark. The territorial marshal had warned him just last week. "They're getting desperate, Silas. Desperate men don't wait for midnight anymore." He moved toward this barn door with the practiced silence of a man who'd learned stealth during the war, his boots making no sound on the packed earth floor. The knocking came again, and now he could hear something else: a child's cough, quickly muffled, and a woman's whispered, "Shh." His fingers tightened on the rifle. Rustlers didn't bring children. Indians didn't knock, which meant whoever stood on the other side of that door was either truly desperate or running from something worse than the coming storm. Silas threw the bolt and yanked the door open in one motion, rifle raised, his finger resting lightly on the trigger. For a moment, the 3 figures before him seemed like apparitions conjured by the wind. So still, so unlikely, that his mind struggled to accept them as real. The woman, no, girl really, couldn't have been more than 17, stood in the center, one hand holding a boy of perhaps 5 or 6, the other arm wrapped around a girl who looked to be 8 or 9. All 3 wore clothes that might once have been decent, but were now little more than rags held together by hope and determination. The boy's feet, Silas noticed with a jolt that went through him like lightning, were wrapped in burlap sacks tied with twine. The little girl's lips had taken on the blue-gray tinge that preceded frostbite, and the young woman's eyes. God, her eyes were the color of slate before a storm, and held a kind of fierce, cornered dignity that reminded him of a cougar he'd once found caught in a trap, injured but still dangerous, still proud. "Can we sleep in your barn, sir?" Her voice was steady despite the cold that must have been seeping into her bones, despite the way her whole body trembled with more than just the temperature. "Just tonight. The storm's coming, and we won't make it to town. We won't be any trouble. We'll be gone before dawn." Silas lowered the rifle slowly, his mind still catching up to what his eyes were showing him. The boy swayed slightly, his small face pinched with exhaustion and cold. The girl beside him, his sister clearly, they had the same dark hair, the same sharp chin, pressed closer to the older one's side, her eyes never leaving Silas's face with an intensity that was unnerving in one so young. "Where are your people?" His voice came out rougher than he'd intended, harsh from disuse and shock. "Dead, sir." The young woman's chin lifted slightly, and he saw the cost of that simple statement in the way her jaw tightened. 6 weeks now. Cholera took them both within 2 days of each other. We've been making our way north since. We've got an uncle in Helena, or we did. We're trying to reach him before winter sets proper. Helena was 150 miles north, through mountain passes that would be deadly once the snows came in earnest. Silas looked past them to the darkening sky, where clouds were building like a wall, black and heavy with the promise of the season's first real blizzard. He'd seen enough Montana storms to know this one would be bad, the kind that buried wagons and froze travelers in their tracks, leaving them like statues to be found when the thaw came. His eyes dropped to the boy's feet again, to the inadequate wrapping that was already stained with red. The child had been walking, probably for miles, probably all day. The rage that suddenly filled Silas wasn't directed at these children or their desperate guardian. It was aimed at a world that could reduce human beings to this state, that could leave children's feet bleeding through rags while good Christian folk in warm houses pretended not to see. "Storm's not waiting till tonight," he said, his words clipped. "It'll be here within the hour. You stay in the barn, you'll freeze before morning." The young woman's face went very still, her eyes searching his for the trap she clearly expected. "We'll manage, sir. We've got blankets and we can build a small fire." "Fire in my barn?" Silas's laugh was short and bitter. "That's not managing, girl. That's suicide. You'll burn down my livelihood trying to keep warm." He stepped back, jerking his head toward the barn's interior. "Get inside. There's hay in the loft that'll keep you off the ground, and you can burrow into it for warmth. I'll bring blankets." "We don't want charity." The words came out fierce, proud, and Silas recognized the tone. It was the same one he'd used himself countless times since Mary died. The sound of someone who'd learned that accepting help meant accepting pity, and pity was a poison that destroyed from the inside out. "Didn't offer any," he replied, matching her tone. "Offered shelter. Storm like this comes through, I lose stock. Can't afford to lose stock checking on frozen strangers in my barn every hour. This way, I know where you are. Know you won't be setting fires or causing trouble. It's practical, not charitable. There's a difference." It was a lie, of course, at least partially, but it was the kind of lie that allowed dignity to remain intact, and he saw her recognize it for what it was. Something in her expression shifted, just slightly, and she gave a single sharp nod. "We'll be gone at first light," she said. "Storm will say when you can go," Silas told her. "Not your pride. Now get inside before that boy loses toes." He watched them file into the barn. The young woman first, still wary, still ready to grab her siblings and run if needed. The girl went next, her eyes huge in her pinched face, and finally the boy, limping so badly that Silas had to look away from the sight of it. Once they were inside, he pulled the door partially closed against the rising wind and headed for the house at a pace just short of running. The first snowflakes were already falling, fat and heavy, the kind that meant business. He had maybe 30 minutes before visibility dropped to nothing. His house stood 60 yards from the barn, a solid structure of logs and stone that he'd built with Mary in the early years of their marriage, when they'd still believed the future was something bright and full of promise. He didn't let himself think about her as he moved through the rooms, gathering what he needed. Wool blankets from the chest at the foot of his bed, a lantern, matches, and from the kitchen, bread and cheese, and the remains of the stew he'd made 2 days ago. The dust on the toy horse on the mantelpiece caught his eye as he passed through the parlor, and his steps faltered. Lily would have been 5 now, if she'd lived. The same age as that boy in the barn. He'd carved that horse during Mary's pregnancy, his hands shaping the wood while she knitted tiny clothes and hummed hymns about joy and grace and blessings. Neither of them had known that she was humming her own funeral songs. Silas shook his head sharply, banishing the memory, and kept moving. The past was a well he'd learned not to peer into too often, and he wasn't about to start now. When he returned to the barn, the young woman had gotten the children up into the hayloft. He could see them huddled together in the dim light, the boy already half asleep against his sister's shoulder. The older girl was trying to arrange loose hay around them for insulation, her movements efficient despite her obvious exhaustion. "Got blankets," Silas called up. "And food. You eaten today?" "We're fine, sir," but her eyes went to the bundle in his arms with an hunger that belied her words. That wasn't the question. He climbed the ladder, moving carefully with his burden. The loft was warmer than the ground floor, as he'd known it would be. Heat rose, and the animals below generated enough warmth to take the worst edge off the cold. Up close, he could see details he'd missed in the fading light outside. The young woman's hands were raw and cracked, her fingernails broken down to the quick. The little girl's dress had been mended so many times that it was more patch than original fabric. And the boy, Christ, the boy's eyes had the glazed look of fever. "He's sick," Silas said flatly, kneeling beside them. "Just tired." But the young woman's voice wavered. "He'll be fine with rest." Silas unwrapped the boy's feet with gentle hands, revealing the damage beneath. The child whimpered but didn't pull away, which told Silas the boy was either too exhausted or too accustomed to pain to protest. The soles of his feet were a mass of blisters, some broken, some infected. How far had they walked on these feet? How many miles of Montana territory had this child crossed while in agony? "This is bad," Silas said quietly. He looked up at the young woman who was watching him with eyes that expected condemnation. "Needs cleaning and proper bandaging. Might need more than that if the infection's taken hold." "We'll manage," she said again, but there was less conviction in it now, less certainty. "Will you stop saying that?" Silas stood abruptly, frustration bleeding into his voice. "You clearly can't manage. That's not weakness, it's just fact. The boy's got infection in both feet, you're half-starved, and this one," he gestured to the girl, "is well on her way to pneumonia, if that cough is any indication. Managing would have been stopping in the last town, finding work, staying put till you could outfit yourselves proper for the journey." "There was no work?" The young woman's voice went hard and flat. "Not for us. Not after what our father did." "And what did your father do?" She lifted her chin, that same proud, defiant gesture. "Borrowed money he couldn't pay back. Made promises he couldn't keep. Cheated at cards when he got desperate. By the time he died, half the town wanted his blood, and the other half wanted his debt settled. We couldn't stay. We tried, but—" Her voice broke just for a moment before she pulled it back under control. "We left in the night. Took what we could carry. This is what we could carry." Silas looked at the three of them, at the fierce, frightened girl trying to parent her siblings, at the feverish boy who should have been playing with toy horses instead of walking himself bloody, at the little girl whose eyes held too much understanding for her years. "What's your name?" he asked. She hesitated, as if even that much information was dangerous to give. Then, Nora Hale. This is Clara," she touched the girl's shoulder, "and Ben." "Silas Gentry. This is my land, my barn, and for tonight at least, you're under my protection. That means you do what I tell you, when I tell you. Understood?" Nora's eyes narrowed. "What do you want in return?" The question hit him like a slap, and he understood in that moment exactly what kind of men she'd encountered on this journey, exactly what kind of offers she'd already refused. His hands clenched at his sides, rage building again. Not at her, never at her, but at every man who'd looked at a desperate girl with hungry eyes and seen opportunity instead of humanity. "Not a damn thing," he said, his voice low and hard. "Except that you stay alive, and those children don't lose any more than they already have. That's what I want. That a problem for you?" She stared at him for a long moment, searching his face for the lie, for the trap. Whatever she saw there must have satisfied her because she finally gave a small nod. "Good." Silas picked up the lantern. "I'm going to get hot water and medical supplies. You get them wrapped in these blankets and make sure they eat. All of you eat. When I come back, I'm cleaning and bandaging that boy's feet, and there's not going to be any argument about it. Clear?" "Clear." He was halfway down the ladder when her voice stopped him. "Mr. Gentry?" "Thank you." Silas didn't turn around. He couldn't. If he did, she'd see the way his jaw was working, the way his eyes had gone hot with tears he hadn't allowed himself to shed in years. "Silas," he said roughly. "Just Silas." The storm hit in earnest as he made his way back to the house, the snow coming down so thick and fast that he could barely see the ground beneath his feet. By the time he reached the porch, the barn had disappeared into the white wall of the blizzard, and he knew with absolute certainty that if those three souls had still been out on the road, they'd have died tonight. Frozen solid, buried under drifts, to be found in the spring as nothing but bones and tattered cloth. Inside, he built up the fire and set water to boil, moving through the familiar tasks while his mind worked at the problem of three strangers and a storm that might last days. He had supplies enough: flour, salt pork, dried beans, coffee. He'd put up preserves in the summer, though he'd barely touched them. There was meat hanging in the smokehouse, and the cellar was full of root vegetables. He could feed them. That wasn't the issue. The issue was what came after. Because Nora Hale might believe they'd be gone at first light, might believe she and her siblings would somehow make it to Helena before winter locked down the passes, but Silas knew better. That boy wouldn't be walking for weeks, maybe longer. The infection in his feet could turn serious, could turn deadly, if not treated properly. And even if by some miracle they all recovered, even if the weather cleared, winter was coming fast and hard, and there was no way 3 people on foot were crossing that distance before the deep snows fell, which meant they'd be here longer than a night, probably longer than a week. Possibly. Silas shook his head sharply, refusing to follow that thought to its conclusion. He didn't need complications, didn't need people in his life, in his space, in his carefully constructed solitude. He'd learned to be alone, learned to prefer it, learned that alone meant safe, meant nobody else could die while he stood helpless and useless and paralyzed by his own cowardice. But when he loaded the hot water, bandages, and salve onto a tray and headed back out into the blizzard, when he fought his way through a wind that tried to knock him off his feet and snow that stung like needles, he knew he was already caught, already involved, already responsible in a way that terrified him more than any storm ever could. The barn was dark except for the single lantern in the loft. He could hear Clara's cough even before he opened the door, a deep, rattling sound that spoke of lungs full of fluid. Wonderful. Infection in the boy, pneumonia brewing in the girl, and Nora herself running on nothing but will and determination. When he climbed back into the loft, he found them exactly as he'd left them, huddled together under the blankets, the bread and cheese untouched beside them. "You didn't eat," he said, setting down the medical supplies. "We were waiting," Nora said quietly. It seemed polite. "Polite?" Silas laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Girl, politeness is for tea parties and church socials. This is survival. Eat the damn food." He turned his attention to Ben, who watched him with wide, feverish eyes as Silas unwrapped his feet again. The boy was burning up, his small body radiating heat even in the cold barn. The infection was worse than Silas had feared. Angry red lines were starting to track up from the worst of the blisters, heading toward his ankles like poisonous vines. "This is going to hurt," Silas told him quietly, meeting those fever-bright eyes. "I'm sorry for that. But if we don't clean it proper, you could lose more than your toes, you understand?" Ben nodded, his small face solemn and far too old for his years. "You scream if you need to," Silas continued, dipping a cloth in the hot water. "Nobody here will think less of you. Sometimes the bravest thing a man can do is admit when something hurts." He worked as gently as possible, cleaning away the dirt and dried blood, draining the worst of the blisters, applying salve that made Ben whimper and bite down on his lip until it bled. Nora held her brother's hand throughout, murmuring quiet words of comfort that Silas couldn't quite hear but felt in his chest nonetheless. Clara fell asleep against Nora's shoulder, her cough finally quieting. The bread and cheese slowly disappeared, probably into Nora's pocket for later, when she thought Silas wouldn't notice. He pretended not to see. When he finally finished bandaging Ben's feet, the boy was pale and shaking, tears tracking silently down his cheeks. Silas pulled the blanket back over him with gentle hands. "You did good, son," he said softly. "Real good." "Thank you, sir," Ben whispered. "Silas," he corrected. "Just Silas." He gathered his supplies, ready to retreat back to his empty house and his silent rooms, but Nora's voice stopped him again. "Why are you helping us?" It was a fair question, a good question. Silas looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not just desperation but intelligence, saw not just fear but courage, saw someone who'd stepped into the role of mother to her siblings because there was nobody else, and was carrying it with a grace that shamed him. "Because someone should," he said finally. "And I'm the one here." "That's not much of a reason." "It's the only one I've got." He was halfway down the ladder again when he heard her speak, so quietly he almost missed it over the wind. "Your wife, the one whose things fill that house. What happened to her?" Silas froze, his hands gripping the ladder rung so tightly his knuckles went white. Nobody in town asked him about Mary anymore. They'd learned not to. Ezekiel knew, of course, had been there that terrible night, but even he had the sense to leave it unspoken. "She died," Silas said, his voice barely audible. "5 years ago. Her and our daughter both. I'm sorry." "Don't be. It was my fault." He didn't wait for her response, didn't want to hear whatever platitude she might offer. He just descended the ladder and walked out into the storm, where the wind could drown out the sound of his own thoughts and the snow could hide the expression on his face. The house felt colder than the barn when he finally stumbled inside, shaking snow from his coat and stamping feeling back into his feet. The fire had burned down to embers, and he stood in front of it for a long time, not bothering to rebuild it, just watching the fading light and remembering another night when snow fell and a woman screamed and he stood frozen in town, too afraid to come home, too much of a coward to face what was happening. Mary had gone into labor 2 months early. She'd been alone except for old Mrs. Henderson from the neighboring ranch, who'd come when she heard the screams, but had no medical training, no knowledge of how to handle a breech birth or stop the bleeding that came after. By the time Silas made it back, by the time he finally forced himself to ride through the storm he'd been hiding from, it was over, both of them gone. Mary's eyes still open, staring at nothing. The baby, his daughter, his Lily, so tiny and perfect and utterly, completely still. He'd been in town drinking, trying to work up the courage to come home, to face impending fatherhood, to stop being terrified that he'd fail them both. And in his cowardice, he'd done exactly that. He'd failed them in the worst way possible. Silas pulled in a shaking breath and forced his hands to unclench. That was the past. It was done. No amount of remembering would change it. No amount of guilt would bring them back. He'd learned to live with it the way a man learns to live with a missing limb, aware always of the absence, of the phantom pain, but functional nonetheless. The storm raged outside, shaking the windows, howling down the chimney. Somewhere in his barn, 3 strangers huddled together for warmth, depending on him to keep them alive. The weight of that responsibility should have terrified him, should have sent him right back to that bottle he kept hidden in the kitchen, the one he'd managed to ignore for the better part of a year now. Instead, for the first time since Mary died, Silas felt something other than the gnawing emptiness that had become his constant companion. He felt needed, necessary, like maybe his continued existence wasn't just an accident or a punishment, but served some purpose he hadn't yet understood. It was a dangerous feeling. Hope always was. He rebuilt the fire and tried not to think about gray eyes the color of storm clouds, or small hands that held on to each other with the fierce determination of those who had nothing else left to lose, or the fact that somewhere deep in the frozen wasteland of his chest, something long dormant had begun, ever so slightly, to thaw. Outside, the wind howled and the snow fell, and the night stretched long and dark across the Montana territory. In the barn, Clara coughed in her sleep. Ben whimpered from dreams of pain and cold, and Nora Hale lay awake, staring at the barn rafters, wondering if they'd finally found safety, or if this was just another stop on a journey that would end the same way all their other stops had ended, in disappointment and betrayal and the necessity of running again. Neither she nor Silas slept that night, both of them listening to the storm, both of them wondering what morning would bring. Both of them already changed in ways they didn't yet understand by 6 simple words spoken at a barn door. "Can we sleep in your barn?" And the answer that came after, not in words but in actions, in the offering of shelter and the careful bandaging of a child's feet, in the understanding that sometimes mercy doesn't ask questions, doesn't demand explanations, doesn't wait for the perfect moment. Sometimes mercy just opens the door and says, "Storm's coming. You'll stay till it breaks." Even if neither party quite understands yet that the real storm, the one that will either destroy them all or rebuild them into something neither broken nor whole, but something altogether new, hasn't even begun. Morning came not with light, but with a gradual lessening of the darkness, the blizzard still raging so fiercely that Silas couldn't see the barn from his kitchen window. He'd been up for hours, moving restlessly through the house, stoking fires and brewing coffee he didn't drink, his mind circling back again and again to the 3 people sleeping in his barn. Or not sleeping. He suspected Nora Hale wasn't the type to rest easy, especially not in a strange place, depending on the charity of a man she didn't know. He'd told her it wasn't charity. Had meant it, too. But standing in his kitchen now, loading a tray with far more food than was strictly necessary, biscuits he'd actually made fresh, bacon from the smokehouse, eggs from the hens who'd had the sense to stay in their coop, coffee, milk, even a precious spoonful of honey he'd been hoarding. He had to admit that maybe he'd been lying to them both. This was charity, or something like it. Something that felt suspiciously like caring, which was even more dangerous. The wind nearly knocked him off his feet when he stepped outside, and the cold hit like a physical blow. He bent his head against it and pushed forward, following the path he'd worn the night before, now completely buried under fresh snow. Each step took effort, his boots sinking deep, and by the time he reached the barn door, his lungs burned and ice had formed in his beard. Inside, the animals shifted and stamped, restless from the storm. His mare, Daisy, nickered a greeting, and he made a mental note to check on all of them properly once he'd dealt with his human guests. The loft was quiet except for that same rattling cough from Clara, slightly worse than it had been the night before. Silas climbed the ladder carefully, balancing the tray, and found them awake, or at least Nora was, sitting upright with her back against a hay bale, both children tucked against her sides. Her eyes tracked him with the wariness of a wild thing, but she didn't speak until he'd set the tray down. "The storm hasn't broken," she said. It wasn't a question. "Won't for a while yet. Day, maybe 2. He gestured to the food. "Figured you'd be hungry." "We can't. If you say you can't accept it, I'm going to dump this whole tray in the hay and waste it all, and then we'll all feel foolish. Eat." A smile ghosted across her face, so quick he almost missed it. "You're not very good at this." "At what?" "Being kind. You do it like it's a burden." "Maybe it is." But he found himself almost smiling back, which was disorienting enough that he had to look away. "How's the boy?" As if in answer, Ben stirred and whimpered, his small face flushed with fever. Nora's hand went immediately to his forehead, and Silas saw the fear flash across her features before she could mask it. "He's worse," she admitted quietly. Silas knelt beside them and checked the bandages on Ben's feet. The infection had continued to spread overnight, the red lines now reaching halfway to his knees. The child was burning up, his breathing shallow and rapid. "He needs a doctor," Nora said, and he could hear the desperation she was trying to keep out of her voice. "Nearest doctor is in town, 6 miles away. Can't make it there in this storm, and even if we could, Doc Hartwell wouldn't come out in this weather for love or money." Silas sat back on his heels, thinking. "But I've got medicine in the house. Willow bark tea for the fever, and I've got sulfur powder that might draw out the infection. Used it on horses. Should work the same on people." "Should?" Nora's eyes went sharp. "Will," he corrected with more confidence than he felt. "Will work, but he needs to be somewhere warmer than this. That fever needs to break, and it won't do it out here. We can't impose—" "Stop." Silas held up a hand. "Just stop with the pride for 5 minutes and think about what's best for your brother. He stays out here, he might not see tomorrow. In the house, he's got a chance. That's not charity or kindness or whatever you want to call it. That's just arithmetic." Nora stared at him for a long moment, and he could see the war happening behind her eyes, the need to protect her siblings fighting against the stubborn independence that had probably kept them alive this long. Finally, she gave a single, sharp nod. "Just until he's better." "Just until the storm breaks and he can walk?" Silas countered. No point in making promises neither of them believed. "Now eat something before the food gets cold. I'll ready the house." He was halfway down the ladder when Clara spoke for the first time, her voice small and hoarse from coughing. "Mister, do you got a wife?" Silas froze. Nora made a sharp sound that might have been a reprimand, but Clara continued, undeterred. "It's just, Nora said we can't go in a man's house if he don't got a wife. She said it ain't proper." "Clara," Nora started, but Silas cut her off. "Had a wife," he said, still not turning around. "Don't anymore. And your sister's right. It ain't proper, but proper doesn't mean much when weighed against staying alive. You ask any preacher in the territory, he'll tell you God values life over propriety. Probably. I'm not much for preachers, so I couldn't say for certain." He climbed down before Clara could ask any more questions, before Nora could see the way his hands were shaking. The child's casual inquiry had punched through his defenses like they were paper, leaving him raw and exposed in a way he hadn't been in years. The house needed preparing. He moved through it mechanically, lighting fires in both the parlor and the spare bedroom, the one he'd been using for storage since Mary died because he couldn't stand to look at the empty space where a cradle should have been. He cleared out the boxes and crates, swept the floor, made up the bed with sheets that still smelled faintly of lavender from the sachets Mary had made. The toy horse on the mantelpiece caught his eye again as he passed through the parlor, and this time he didn't look away. He'd carved it during Mary's 7th month, his hands shaping the wood while she read aloud from her Bible, her voice soft and full of contentment. She'd been so certain everything would be fine, so sure that God had blessed them with this child and would see them through the birthing. Silas had believed her, or wanted to. But there'd been a fear in him even then, a cold certainty that something so good couldn't possibly last, that happiness was just a prelude to loss. And he'd been right, hadn't he? He'd been absolutely right. He grabbed the toy horse and shoved it in a drawer, out of sight, where it should have stayed all along. By the time he made his way back to the barn, the wind had picked up even more, the snow falling so thick it was like being inside a cloud. He found them ready. Nora had wrapped both children in the blankets he'd brought, had even managed to get some food into them. Ben was limp and feverish, his eyes unfocused, but Clara was alert, watching everything with those two old eyes. "I'll take the boy," Silas said. "You bring your sister. Stay close behind me. If you lose sight of me in the storm, stop moving and yell. Don't try to find your way. You'll get turned around and freeze. Understand?" Nora nodded. He could see her jaw set with determination as she lifted Clara, who despite her small size seemed to take all of Nora's strength to carry. Silas wrapped Ben in his own coat before picking him up, cradling the boy against his chest. The child was so light it made his heart hurt. Too light, all bones and sharp angles where there should have been healthy flesh. How long had they been starving? How many meals had Nora skipped to make sure her siblings ate? The journey from barn to house felt like crossing the whole territory. The wind fought them for every step, and more than once Silas had to stop and make sure Nora was still behind him. Her slight figure bent nearly double against the gale, Clara's face buried in her sister's shoulder. When they finally stumbled through the door, all of them were covered in snow and shaking from more than just the cold. "Bedroom's there," Silas said, jerking his head toward the hallway. "Get the boy on the bed. I'll start the tea." But Nora stood frozen in the entryway, staring around at the house with an expression he couldn't quite read. It wasn't until Clara whispered, "It's so warm," that he understood. This was probably the first real warmth they'd felt in weeks, maybe months. "Fire's in the parlor, too," he said gruffly, suddenly embarrassed by his own comfort, by the fact that he'd had all this space and heat and safety while they'd been sleeping in barns and walking themselves bloody. "Get yourselves settled. I'll be back." In the kitchen, he set water to boil and measured out willow bark, trying to remember the proportions old Doc Hartwell had taught him back during the war. Too much, and it would make the boy sicker. Too little, and it wouldn't touch the fever. He added a pinch of this, a handful of that, working from memory and instinct and the kind of desperate hope that felt suspiciously like prayer. When he carried the tea to the bedroom, he found Nora sitting on the edge of the bed, her hand on Ben's forehead, her face pale and tight with worry. Clara was curled in a chair by the window, wrapped in a quilt, watching the storm with fascinated horror. "This is for the fever," Silas said, setting the cup down. "He needs to drink all of it, even though it tastes like hell. After that, I'll treat his feet again." "He's so hot," Nora whispered. "I've never felt him this hot." "Fever means his body's fighting. That's good. Means he's still fighting." Silas helped prop Ben up, supporting the boy's head while Nora coaxed the tea between his lips. The child struggled weakly, making a face at the bitter taste, but Nora was relentless, murmuring encouragement until the cup was empty. "Good," Silas said. "That's good. Now we wait for it to work." "And if it doesn't?" He met her eyes, those storm-gray eyes that held too much fear and too much strength all at once. "Then we try something else, and then something after that. We keep trying until it works. Or until it's too late. Not going to be too late." He said it with a certainty he didn't feel, but sometimes certainty was a choice, not a feeling. I've seen worse than this pull through. It was a lie, but it was the kind of lie that gave hope, and sometimes hope was more important than truth. He spent the next hour working on Ben's feet again, cleaning and treating and rebandaging while the boy drifted in and out of fevered sleep. Nora never left his side, her hand always somewhere on her brother, his shoulder, his arm, his hair, as if the physical contact could somehow anchor him to consciousness and life. Clara fell asleep in the chair, her small body finally relaxing in the warmth and safety. Silas found himself watching her breathe, counting each rise and fall of her chest, listening to that concerning rattle, but taking comfort in the rhythm of it. Living. Still living. "What happened to them?" Nora asked suddenly. "Your wife and child." Silas's hand stilled on the bandage he was tying. He should have expected this. She'd asked last night, and he'd given her nothing. Of course she'd push again. She was the type who'd need to know, who'd need to understand what kind of man she was trusting with her family's lives. "She went into labor early," he said finally, his voice flat and empty of inflection. "I wasn't here." "Where were you?" "Town. Drinking." The words tasted like ash. "I was scared. Of being a father, of failing them, of—" He broke off, shook his head. "Doesn't matter. What matters is I wasn't here when she needed me. By the time I got back, they were both gone." "How long ago?" 5 years. October. Right around this time, actually." He finished the bandage and sat back. "There. That should hold." "Is that why you live alone? Why this whole house feels like—" Nora gestured vaguely. "Like a grave?" The observation was so accurate, so cutting, that Silas actually flinched. "Grave's a good word for it. That's exactly what it is. I buried them, and then I buried myself. Seemed like the right thing to do. And now? And now 3 strangers showed up needing help, and I'm too much of a coward to turn them away." He stood abruptly, needing to move, needing to escape the weight of her gaze. "You should rest, both of you. I'll check on the boy every few hours, make sure the fever breaks." "Silas?" She said his name like it meant something, like it was important. "Thank you for all of this. I know you don't want to hear it, but thank you." He nodded once, sharp and uncomfortable, and fled to the kitchen where he could pretend to be busy with tasks that didn't require him to look at Nora Hale's eyes, or think about the way saying his name in that tone made something crack open in his chest. The day crawled by with the storm still raging. Silas checked on Ben every hour, watching the fever spike and hold, willing the medicine to work. He brought food that Nora picked at, but mostly gave to Clara, who ate like she couldn't quite believe the food was real and might disappear if she looked away. In the afternoon, Ezekiel showed up, having fought his way over from his own small cabin on the property. He was Silas's ranch hand, a freed slave who'd come west after the war and had a way with horses that bordered on magical. He was also the closest thing Silas had to a friend, though neither of them would have used that word. "Thought you might be buried under snow," Ezekiel said, stamping his boots at the door. "Came to dig you out, but I see you got company instead." "Travelers," Silas said shortly. "Caught in the storm." Ezekiel's dark eyes took in the details, the women's clothes drying by the fire, the sound of Clara's cough from the bedroom, the tension in Silas's shoulders. "That's so. Travelers usually sleep in the barn. Boy's sick, needed warmth." "Mm-hmm." Ezekiel's expression was knowing. "And that's the only reason?" "That's the only reason that matters." Silas poured coffee, handed a cup to Ezekiel. "Storm should break tomorrow. They'll be gone after that." "Boy sounded pretty sick to me. That cough ain't natural. I'm handling it. Never said you weren't." Ezekiel sipped his coffee, watching Silas over the rim. "Just wondering if you're ready to have people in this house again. Been a long time since these walls heard anything but your footsteps and your ghosts." "They're not staying," Silas said firmly. "Soon as the weather clears and the boy can walk, they're gone." "Where they headed?" "Helena. Got an uncle there, apparently." Ezekiel's eyebrows rose. "That's a hard journey this time of year. Near impossible for folks on foot." "Not my problem." "No?" Ezekiel set down his cup. "Then why you got that look on your face like it is?" Before Silas could answer, Clara appeared in the doorway, wrapped in the quilt like a small ghost. Her eyes went wide at the sight of Ezekiel, and she shrank back. "It's all right," Silas said quickly. "This is Ezekiel. He works here. He He paused, searching for the right word. He's good people. Ezekiel smiled, the kind of gentle smile that transformed his weathered face. Hello there, little miss. You feeling better? Clara nodded slowly, still wary. Ben's awake. He asked for water. Silas was moving before she finished speaking, Ezekiel right behind him. In the bedroom, they found Ben conscious but confused, his eyes unfocused as Nora tried to get him to drink. The fever's broken, she said, and there was relief in her voice so profound it made her shake. I think he's through the worst of it. Silas felt something in his chest loosen, some tension he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. Good. That's good. Keep him drinking. Water, broth if you can get it down him. And those feet need to stay elevated and clean. Ezekiel caught his eye, and there was something in his expression. Approval, maybe, or understanding. I'll stay close, he said quietly, in case you need help with anything. What he meant was, I'll stay close because you're doing something important here. Something that might break you or remake you, and either way, you shouldn't be alone. Silas nodded, throat tight. Appreciate it. The rest of the day passed in a blur of medicine and food and the constant monitoring of Ben's condition. The fever didn't return, and gradually the red lines on his legs began to fade, the infection responding to Silas's rough treatment. By evening, the boy was able to eat a little broth and even managed a weak smile when Clara told him about the snow outside. Nora barely left his side, and Silas found himself watching her when she wasn't looking. The careful way she touched her siblings, the fierce protectiveness in every gesture, the exhaustion she was trying to hide. She was so young, far too young to carry this weight, and yet she carried it with a grace that made his own failures feel heavier. That night, he made a proper supper. Venison stew with vegetables from the cellar, fresh bread, even dried apple pie for after. They ate in the kitchen, all of them crowded around the table, and for the first time in 5 years, the house didn't feel quite so empty. This is wonderful, Nora said softly. I can't remember the last time we had a real meal. Probably before your folks died, Silas said. Before that, even. Papa wasn't much for providing. There was no bitterness in her voice, just resignation. He was better at promises than delivering on them. Nora makes good stew, Clara offered loyally. When we got ingredients. Which wasn't often, Nora admitted. I'm not much of a cook. Mother tried to teach me, but I was always more interested in books than recipes. You read? Silas asked, surprised. When I can. Mother was a teacher before she married. She made sure we all learned letters and numbers. Nora's face softened with memory. She used to say education was the only thing nobody could take from you, no matter how poor you got. Smart woman. She was. Nora's smile faded. I wish... She broke off, shaking her head. It doesn't matter what I wish. She's gone, and wishing won't bring her back. Silas understood that particular futility all too well. No, he agreed quietly. It won't. After supper, Nora insisted on washing the dishes despite Silas's protests. He watched her work, her movements efficient, and found himself struck by how easily she'd slipped into the rhythms of his kitchen, how natural it felt to have her there. Dangerous thoughts, thoughts he had no business entertaining. When Ben and Clara were finally settled for the night, Nora lingered in the parlor where Silas sat pretending to read a book he'd already read 3 times. She stood by the fireplace, her fingers trailing across the mantel, and stopped at the place where the toy horse used to sit. There's dust here, she said quietly, like something was removed recently. Silas said nothing. Something small, child-sized maybe. Her eyes met his. A toy? Horse, he admitted roughly. I carved it for my daughter. What was her name? Lily. The name felt strange in his mouth, sharp and sweet all at once. He hadn't said it aloud in years. We were going to name her Lily. That's beautiful. Nora turned back to the empty space on the mantel. Where is it now? Put it away. Seemed wrong to have it sitting there when she never got to hold it. Or maybe, Nora said softly, it seemed wrong because it reminded you that she was real, that she existed, even if only for a moment, that she mattered. The words hit like a blow, and Silas found himself on his feet, anger flaring hot and defensive. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Don't I?" She turned to face him fully. "I watched my parents die, Silas. Watched them waste away, helpless to do anything. And after, I wanted to forget. Wanted to pretend it never happened, that they never existed, because remembering hurt too much. But Clara and Ben needed me to remember. Needed me to tell them stories about Mama's laugh and Papa's terrible jokes. Needed the memories to stay alive, even when everything else was gone. It's not the same, isn't it?" Her voice was gentle but unyielding. "You put away the toy because remembering hurts, but forgetting would hurt more. That toy, that's proof she was loved, that she mattered. That's not something to hide away." Silas opened his mouth to argue, to defend his choice, but the words wouldn't come. 'Cause she was right. God help him, this 17-year-old girl who'd been through hell and come out still fighting was absolutely right. "She was loved," he said finally, his voice breaking. "More than I knew how to say." "Then say it now." Nora moved to the drawer where he'd hidden the toy, opened it with the kind of gentle determination that suggested she'd been watching him more carefully than he'd realized. She pulled out the wooden horse and held it up to the firelight, examining the careful craftsmanship. "Tell me about her. Tell me what she meant to you." And somehow, impossibly, he did. The words came haltingly at first, then faster, spilling out like water through a broken dam. He told her about Mary's pregnancy, about his fear and excitement all tangled together, about the plans they'd made, the future they'd imagined, about the moment he'd held his daughter's tiny, still body and felt his heart crack clean through. "I wasn't there," he said again, the old refrain. "I should have been there, and I wasn't." "No," Nora agreed. "You weren't, and that's something you'll have to carry." "But Silas," she set the toy horse back on the mantel, in its old place where it caught the firelight and threw dancing shadows. "She was loved. You loved her. That matters. That will always matter." He stared at the toy horse, at the proof of his love and his failure all carved into one piece of wood, and felt something shift inside him. Not healing, it was too soon for that, might always be too soon, but maybe the beginning of acceptance, the understanding that he could carry both the love and the loss, that one didn't cancel out the other. "Thank you," he said quietly. Nora smiled, and it transformed her face from merely pretty to something approaching beautiful. "You're welcome. For what it's worth, I think you're a good man, Silas Gentry. A good man who made a mistake. There's a difference." She left him then, disappearing into the bedroom where her siblings slept, and Silas stayed in the parlor until the fire burned down to embers, staring at the toy horse and remembering. Not just the pain this time, but the joy too. The way Mary's face had glowed when she felt the baby kick, the names they'd argued over, laughing, the cradle he'd built with such care and hope. It hurt to remember, but Nora was right. Forgetting would hurt more. Outside, the storm finally began to ease, the wind dying down to a whisper, the snow falling more gently. By morning it would be clear, and Nora would expect to leave. Would insist on it probably, her pride demanding she not overstay their welcome. But Ben's feet wouldn't be healed. Clara's cough still rattled in her chest, and Nora herself was running on nothing but determination and stubbornness, so thin he could probably count her ribs if he tried. They needed more time. They needed care and feeding and safety, at least until winter proper set in and made the journey north truly impossible. And maybe, just maybe, he needed them too. Needed their presence to remind him that this house was meant for living, not entombing. That warmth and laughter and the sound of children's voices weren't betrayals of Mary's memory, but celebrations of the life she'd wanted for him. He'd let them stay, just a while longer. Just until they were ready. And if some part of him hoped they'd never be quite ready, if some treacherous corner of his heart was already imagining Clara learning to ride that mare, Ben growing strong and healthy, Nora's smile becoming something he saw every day instead of just once, well, he'd deal with that foolishness when it came. For now, he had a house that was finally warm again, and 3 people sleeping under his roof who'd reminded him what it felt like to be needed, to matter, to be something other than a ghost haunting his own life. It wasn't much, but it was something. And after 5 years of nothing, something felt like a miracle. The storm broke just before dawn, leaving the world transformed under 3 feet of pristine snow that sparkled like crushed diamonds in the early light. Silas woke to silence, not the oppressive, empty silence he'd grown accustomed to over the years, but something softer, fuller, alive with the promise of voices that would soon fill it. He lay in his bed listening to the house settle and creak, and heard Clara's cough from down the hall, followed by Nora's gentle murmur of comfort, the sounds of a family, the sounds of life. He should have felt invaded, crowded, uncomfortable. Instead, he felt something dangerously close to contentment. By the time he made it to the kitchen, Nora was already there, standing at the stove with an expression of determined concentration as she attempted to work his cast-iron skillet. She'd braided her hair back from her face, and in the morning light streaming through the window, she looked even younger than 17, a child herself, playing at being grown. "I was trying to make breakfast," she said without turning around, somehow sensing his presence, "to repay you for all your kindness, but I think I'm making a mess instead." Silas came to stand beside her and looked into the pan, where eggs were simultaneously burning and remaining raw in a way that defied physics. "You weren't lying about not being much of a cook. I warned you." But there was humor in her voice, not defensiveness. "Mother died before she could teach me properly, and after that there wasn't always food to practice with. Here." He took the spatula from her hand, their fingers brushing briefly, and felt an uncomfortable jolt at the contact. "You need to keep the heat lower, and you've got to keep them moving, like this." He demonstrated, salvaging what he could of the eggs. "Cooking's just paying attention, same as anything else worth doing." She watched him work with the same intense focus she brought to everything, and he found himself acutely aware of her proximity, of the way she smelled faintly of the lavender soap from Mary's old room, of how small she seemed standing next to him, and yet how much strength radiated from her slight frame. "There," he said gruffly, sliding the rescued eggs onto a plate. "Not pretty, but edible. That's all that matters. You make it look easy." "Practice. Had to learn after Mary died. It was either that or starve, and I was too stubborn for starving." He started fresh eggs in the pan. "You'll learn too, if you're here long enough." The words hung in the air between them, neither quite a question nor quite a statement. Nora's eyes found his, searching. "The storm's broken," she said quietly. "We should go. Boys' feet aren't healed. Girls got pneumonia brewing. And you look like a strong wind would knock you over." Silas kept his attention on the eggs, not trusting himself to look at her. "Storm might be over, but winter's just starting. You won't make it to Helena before the passes close. We have to try. Why?" The question came out sharper than he'd intended. "Because of pride? Because you'd rather die trying than accept help? That's not brave, Nora. That's just foolish." Her jaw set in that stubborn line he was beginning to recognize. "We can't stay here forever. Not asking you to, just asking you to stay until spring, until the children are healthy and the passes are clear and you've got a real chance." He finally looked at her. "That's not forever. That's just sensible. People will talk. People always talk. That's what people do." He plated the eggs with more force than necessary. "Question is whether you care more about what strangers think or about keeping your family alive." It was a low blow and he knew it. But desperation made men cruel sometimes. The thought of them leaving, of watching Nora load those children into a wagon and disappear into the still dangerous cold, made something twist painfully in his chest. Before Nora could respond, Clara appeared in the doorway, wrapped in a blanket and looking marginally better than she had the day before. "Is Ben awake?" she asked, her voice hoarse. "He said he wanted pancakes. Can we have pancakes?" The tension broke. Silas found himself almost smiling. "Pancakes, huh? That's ambitious for a boy who could barely eat broth yesterday." "He says his tummy's really hungry now." Clara climbed onto a chair at the table. "Nora, can we stay? I like it here. It's warm and there's real food and Mr. Silas has books." "You found the books?" Silas asked. Clara nodded enthusiastically. "In the room with all the dust, there's so many. Do you think I could read one?" "Clara," Nora said, a warning in her tone. "We've already imposed too much. Read whatever you want," Silas interrupted. Books don't do anybody any good sitting on shelves collecting dust. They need to be used. Nora's expression was a complicated mix of gratitude and frustration, and he could see the war still happening behind her eyes. But before she could mount another argument, the sound of hoofbeats outside drew their attention. Through the window, they could see riders approaching, 3 of them, picking their way carefully through the snow. Silas's jaw tightened. He recognized the lead horse, the preacher's bay mare, and where Reverend Marcus went, judgment usually followed. "Stay inside," he told Nora. "All of you, let me handle this." "Silas, please." He caught her arm gently. "Just this once. Let me handle it." He met them on the porch, pulling the door shut behind him. Reverend Marcus sat tall in his saddle, flanked by Thomas Whitmore, the town banker, and Sheriff Dale. All 3 wore expressions of grim purpose that made Silas's hackles rise. "Gentlemen," he said evenly, "storm brought you all the way out here?" "Concern brought us," Reverend Marcus replied, his voice carrying that particular tone of righteous certainty that set Silas's teeth on edge. "Ezekiel mentioned you'd taken in travelers. In your home. Unchaperoned. Travelers needed help. I provided it. Don't recall asking permission." "Silas," Thomas Whitmore leaned forward in his saddle, his banker's face arranged in an expression of false sympathy. "We understand you were trying to do the right thing, but an unmarried man sheltering a young woman under his roof, it simply isn't proper. It raises questions, creates talk." "Let it talk then." Silas crossed his arms. "I'm not throwing sick children out into the cold because folks might gossip." "No one's suggesting you throw them out," the sheriff said, though his tone suggested that was exactly what at least some of them were suggesting. "But perhaps they could be accommodated elsewhere. The church has rooms, the boarding house, for which they'd need money they don't have." Silas's voice went flat and hard. "And speaking of money," he turned his attention to Whitmore. "I heard something about debts. The girl's father owed money when he died?" Whitmore had the grace to look uncomfortable. "Thomas Hale had significant debts, yes, gambling debts primarily. When a man dies, his obligations fall to his children? Children who are barely more than babies themselves?" Silas took a step forward, and all 3 men shifted in their saddles. "That's the kind of Christian charity you're peddling these days, Thomas? Collecting blood money from orphans? Now see here. No, you see here." Silas's voice was quiet, but carried the kind of authority that came from barely controlled rage. "Those children in my house have lost everything. Their parents, their home, damn near their lives trying to make it to family that might not even exist anymore. They showed up at my barn begging for shelter, and I gave it. That's what decent people do. That's what the Bible your preacher friend here loves quoting actually says to do." Reverend Marcus's face darkened. "The Bible also has things to say about propriety, about avoiding even the appearance of sin." "The appearance of sin?" Silas laughed, sharp and bitter. "That's what concerns you? Not actual suffering or actual need, but how things might look." He shook his head. "You know what I think? I think you're all so busy worrying about appearances that you've forgotten what substance looks like, what real faith looks like, what actual goodness requires." "We're trying to protect your reputation," Whitmore said stiffly. "And the girls. If word spreads that she's been living here alone with you, then word spreads. I don't give a damn about my reputation. Haven't for years." Silas met each of their eyes in turn. "Now, unless you've got legal grounds to remove them, and Sheriff, you know as well as I do that you don't, I suggest you head back to town before the snow gets too deep for those horses." The 3 men exchanged glances, clearly not having expected this level of resistance. Finally, Reverend Marcus straightened in his saddle, his expression hardening into something ugly. "Very well," he said coldly, "but don't expect the town's support when the consequences of your choices come home to roost, Silas. We tried to help you see reason. What happens now is on your head." They rode off, and Silas watched them go with a sinking feeling in his gut. He'd made enemies today, powerful ones. In a small town like theirs, that kind of enmity could be dangerous. The preacher controlled who was welcome in the church, which meant who was welcome in most social gatherings. The banker controlled credit, which meant survival for most ranchers during hard times. And the sheriff, while technically neutral, was known to look the other way when the town's important men wanted something done. He'd just painted a target on his back. Possibly on Nora's, too. The door opened behind him, and Nora stepped out, her face pale but set with determination. "I heard," she said quietly. "I'm sorry. We'll leave today. I won't let you ruin yourself for us." "Nobody's ruining anything." Silas turned to face her. "And nobody's leaving. Not today. Not this week. Not until I say so. You can't— My land. My house. My decision." He softened his tone slightly. "Nora, they were always going to talk. That's what small-minded people do when they've got nothing better to occupy themselves. But talk is just air. It can't hurt us unless we let it." "You don't understand." She wrapped her arms around herself, looking suddenly very young and very scared. "It's not just talk. In the last town, after Papa died, people said things, did things. They called me a debtor's daughter, said I was bad luck, said I'd bring shame to any decent family. The boys—" She broke off, her jaw working. "Some of them thought a girl with no family and no money was fair game. That's why we left. That's why we've been running." Cold rage flooded through Silas, so intense it made his vision narrow. "Did they hurt you?" "They tried." Her chin lifted with that familiar pride. "I had Papa's knife. They learned I knew how to use it." "Good." The single word came out hard as stone. "And if anyone tries anything like that here, they'll learn I know how to use a rifle. And unlike you, I won't just scare them off." Something shifted in Nora's expression. Relief, maybe, or gratitude, or something more complex that Silas couldn't quite name. "Why are you doing this?" she asked softly. "Really? What are we to you?" It was the same question she'd asked that first night, and he still didn't have a good answer. Or rather, he had several answers, none of which he was quite ready to speak aloud. "Because you remind me what it feels like to be alive. Because your siblings need someone, and I need to be needed. Because looking at you makes me think maybe I could be something other than a ghost haunting his own life." "You're people who needed help," he said finally. "That's enough." She studied his face for a long moment, and he had the unsettling feeling she could see right through him, could read all the things he wasn't saying. Then she nodded slowly. "All right," she said. "We'll stay. But only until spring, and I'll work for our keep. I can cook, or learn to. I can clean and mend and help with the ranch work. I won't be charity, Silas. I can't be." "Deal." He held out his hand, and after a moment's hesitation, she took it. Her hand was small and work-roughened in his, but her grip was firm. Strong. "Now get back inside before you freeze. And tell that brother of yours if he wants pancakes, he's going to have to wait till I finish the eggs." She smiled, a real smile this time, not the careful, guarded expression she usually wore, and disappeared back into the house. Silas stood on the porch a moment longer, looking out at the snow-covered valley and wondering what the hell he'd just committed himself to. The weeks that followed fell into a rhythm that was both strange and oddly natural. Ben healed slowly, his feet improving day by day until he could walk without limping, though Silas insisted he stay off them as much as possible. Clara's cough gradually eased, helped along by the warm house and regular meals and Silas's willingness to dose her with every home remedy he could remember. And Nora transformed his house. It wasn't anything dramatic or obvious. She didn't rearrange furniture or change his routines, but gradually the dust disappeared from corners. Windows that had been filthy for years suddenly gleamed. Meals appeared on the table at regular times, simple but well made as she practiced the cooking techniques he taught her. The house began to smell like bread and stew and wood smoke instead of emptiness and regret. She found Mary's sewing basket and began mending clothes, first her siblings, then Silas's, darning holes in his socks and fixing tears in his shirts that he'd been ignoring for months. She discovered the garden plot buried under snow and made plans for spring planting, sketching layouts and making lists with an enthusiasm that made him smile despite himself. The children bloomed under the steady routine. Ben, once he could walk properly, followed Silas everywhere, to the barn to feed the horses, to the smokehouse to check the meat, to the woodpile to split logs. The boy had a curious mind and asked endless questions that Silas found himself actually enjoying answering. Why do horses need shoes if their hooves are already hard? Ben asked one morning as they worked in the barn. Same reason we need boots, Silas explained, showing him how to clean Daisy's hooves. Protection. A horse working on rocky ground or pulling heavy loads will wear down their hooves faster than they grow. Shoes keep them from getting sore or injured. Can I help put shoes on? Someday, when you're bigger, horses are strong, and if they get spooked, they can hurt you without meaning to. He glanced at the boy's eager face. But you can help me brush them. Daisy here loves a good brushing. He handed Ben a soft brush and watched the child attack the task with determined concentration. The boy had a gentle touch with animals, he'd noticed, a natural ease that couldn't be taught. Mr. Silas, Ben said after a while, can I ask you something? Sure. Are you going to marry Nora? Silas nearly dropped the hoof pick. What? No. Why would you? Where did that come from? Clara says you are. She says that's why we're staying here, because you and Nora are going to get married, and then you'll be our papa. Ben looked up at him with those serious eyes. I think that would be good. I liked having a papa. And you're nice. You'd be a good papa. Silas felt like he'd been kicked in the chest. Ben, we're not. He struggled for words. Your sister and I aren't getting married. We're just helping each other out for a while. That's all. Oh. Ben's face fell. Clara's going to be sad. She really wants to stay. You can stay till spring, Silas said carefully. That's the plan. But then you'll go on to Helena, find your uncle. What if we don't want to go? The question was small and scared. What if we want to stay here with you? Silas had no answer for that. No safe answer anyway. Because the truth was that he was beginning to want them to stay too, was beginning to imagine a future where Clara learned to read from his books, and Ben grew tall helping with the ranch work and Nora. No. He couldn't let himself go down that path, couldn't start hoping for things that were impossible. Let's not worry about that yet, he said finally. Spring's a long way off. A lot can change before then. But the seed had been planted, and over the following days, Silas found himself noticing things he'd been trying not to notice. The way Nora hummed while she worked, old hymns her mother had taught her. The sound of Clara's laughter when Ben told her silly stories. The feeling of coming home to a house that was alive instead of dead, warm instead of cold, full instead of empty. He noticed other things too. The way Nora's eyes tracked him when she thought he wasn't looking. The color that rose in her cheeks when their hands accidentally touched. The careful distance she maintained between them, as if afraid of what might happen if she got too close. Ezekiel noticed too, of course. He had a way of seeing things Silas wanted to keep hidden. You getting attached, Ezekiel observed one afternoon as they worked on mending fence line. To all of them, but especially to her. Don't know what you're talking about, Silas muttered, hammering a post with more force than necessary. Sure you don't. Ezekiel's tone was dry. That's why you find reasons to be wherever she is. Why you teach her cooking like it's the most important thing in the world. Why you look at her like she's water and you're dying of thirst. She's 17 years old. She's 17 going on 30, and you know it. That girl's lived more life in the past few months than most folks live in years. Age ain't just numbers, Silas. It's experience. It's what you've survived. Doesn't matter. Silas drove the post deeper into the frozen ground. Come spring, she's leaving. They're all leaving. That's the agreement. Agreements can change. Not this one. But that night, sitting at the table with all of them, listening to Clara read haltingly from one of his books, while Ben drew pictures with charcoal on slate and Nora sewed by lamplight, Silas felt the careful walls he'd built around his heart beginning to crack. Felt warmth seeping through the cracks like water finding paths through stone. Felt the dangerous possibility of hope taking root in ground he'd thought was permanently barren. It terrified him. The first Sunday after the storm, Reverend Marcus made his position clear. Silas didn't attend church, hadn't since Mary died, but Ezekiel did, and he came back with a face like thunder. He preached about sin, Ezekiel said flatly, about how charity was godly, but how good intentions could lead to wickedness if not properly guided, about how the appearance of impropriety was as dangerous as the sin itself. He didn't name names, but everyone knew who he meant. Let him preach, Silas said, but his hands clenched around his coffee cup. It's not just preaching. Thomas Whitmore stood up after the sermon, called Nora a debtor's daughter, said her father's sins shouldn't be forgotten just because the man died, said debts don't disappear with death. That bastard. Silas was on his feet before he'd consciously decided to move. How much? How much did her father owe? $150, he claimed. Maybe more. It was a fortune to most people, but Silas had money saved. Years of living alone with no one to spend it on had left him with more than he needed. I'll pay it. You do that, and it'll look like you bought her. Ezekiel met his eyes. You know it will. Town's already talking. You settle her debts, they'll say she's your mistress. They'll say worse. I don't care what they say. Maybe you should. Ezekiel's voice was gentle but firm. Because it ain't just your reputation at stake. It's hers. It's those children's. You want Clara going into town and hearing folks call her sister a whore? You want Ben to have to fight every boy who makes a comment? Because that's what's coming if this keeps up. Silas sank back into his chair, running his hands through his hair. Ezekiel was right. He knew it. But what was the alternative? Send them away? Watch them walk back out into the cold and the danger with nothing but hope and determination to sustain them? What do I do? He asked quietly. You tell her the truth, Ezekiel said, about how you feel, about what you want, and then you let her decide. She's too young. She's old enough to raise 2 children alone, old enough to make a 100-mile journey in winter, old enough to decide who she wants and what kind of life she's willing to fight for. Ezekiel stood, placing a hand on Silas's shoulder. Question is whether you're brave enough to let her choose. That night, Silas lay awake listening to the house breathe around him. The creak of floorboards as someone shifted in bed, the whisper of wind against the windows, the distant howl of a coyote on the hills, his house, his land, his carefully constructed solitude. Except it wasn't solitude anymore. It was family, or something like it, something that felt fragile and precious and absolutely terrifying. He thought about Mary, about the promises he'd made at her grave, about how he'd sworn he'd never risk that kind of loss again, never put himself in a position where his cowardice could destroy someone he loved. But wasn't pushing Nora away just another form of cowardice? Wasn't hiding behind excuses about age and propriety and what people might think just another way of protecting himself at her expense? By dawn, he still had no answers. But he knew he couldn't keep pretending this was temporary, that come spring everything would just go back to the way it was. Because nothing was ever going back. He'd been changed by 6 words spoken at a barn door, by gray eyes that saw through his defenses, by the sound of children's laughter in rooms that had been silent too long. He found Nora in the kitchen, already working on breakfast. The morning light caught in her hair, turning the brown strands gold, and when she looked up at him, her smile was soft and unself-conscious, and so beautiful it hurt. "Morning," she said. "I made coffee. It's probably terrible. I still can't get the proportions right, but it's hot." "Nora," he said, and something in his tone made her smile fade, made her turn to face him fully. "We need to talk." "About what?" "Everything," he wanted to say. "About how you've taken my dead house and filled it with life. About how I watch you with your siblings and see the mother you'll someday be. About how the thought of you leaving makes me want to do something desperate and foolish." But before he could find the words, Clara burst into the kitchen, her face flushed with excitement. "Nora! Nora, come look! It snowed again and there's rabbit tracks everywhere, and Ben says maybe we can trap one for Stu." The moment shattered. Nora's eyes held his for a second longer, questioning, but then she turned to her sister. "All right, show me these tracks. But we're not trapping anything without asking Silas first." She followed Clara out, leaving Silas alone with his coffee and his cowardice, and the knowledge that he was running out of time. That eventually the town would force a choice. That eventually he'd have to be brave enough to speak or forever lose the chance. He just hoped that when the moment came, he'd find the courage that had failed him once before. Because this time, the stakes were higher than he'd ever imagined. This time it wasn't just his own heart on the line. It was Nora's, and Clara's, and Ben's, and the possibility of a future he'd stopped believing he deserved. Outside, he could hear the children's voices, bright and happy. Inside, the coffee grew cold in his cup. And somewhere between those two truths, Silas Gentry stood at a crossroads, knowing that whichever path he chose would define the rest of his life. He just had to find the strength to choose. The choice came sooner than Silas expected, and in a way he hadn't anticipated. 3 days after his aborted conversation with Nora, he took Clara riding on Daisy for the first time. The girl had been begging for weeks, and with the weather clear and cold, it seemed as good a time as any. He lifted her into the saddle, her small body barely making an impression on the mare's broad back, and watched her face transform with wonder. "She's so tall," Clara breathed, gripping the saddle horn with white knuckles. "She'll take care of you," Silas assured her, keeping one hand on Daisy's bridle. "She's the gentlest horse I've ever known. Used to belong to my—" He stopped, the words catching. "She was my wife's mare." Clara looked down at him with those two knowing eyes. "The one who died?" "Yes." "Did she like to ride?" "Loved it." The memory came unbidden. Mary on this same horse, her hair flying loose, laughing as she raced across the meadow with abandon that had both terrified and enchanted him. She used to say riding was like flying without leaving the ground. "That's pretty," Clara said softly. Then, with the blunt honesty of children, "Were you going to teach your little girl to ride too?" The question hit him square in the chest, but somehow it didn't hurt as much as it once would have. "Yes, I was. I used to imagine teaching her, watching her grow brave enough to ride alone." "You can teach me instead," Clara offered with such simple generosity that Silas had to look away. "If you want. I don't mind being second choice." "You're not second choice," he said roughly, and realized it was true. This child, with her persistent cough and her fierce love for her siblings, and her careful way of testing whether she was wanted, she wasn't a replacement or a substitute. She was Clara, entirely herself, and that was enough. "You ready to walk?" Her grin was answer enough. He led Daisy in slow circles around the yard while Clara clutched the saddle horn and giggled, her initial fear melting into delight. Ben watched from the porch, jumping and waving, and through the window Silas could see Nora standing at the kitchen counter, her hands still, her attention fixed on them with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Can I call you Papa?" The question came so quietly, Silas almost didn't hear it. He stopped walking, stopped breathing, stopped everything. Clara was looking down at him with hope and fear warring in her face, and he understood that this moment mattered in ways he couldn't fully comprehend. "Why would you want to?" His voice came out hoarse. "Because you take care of us like a papa should. Because you teach me things, and you're patient when I'm slow to learn. Because—" She bit her lip. "Because I miss having a papa. Mine wasn't very good at it, but I loved him anyway. And I think you'd be good at it. I think you'd be the best at it." Something inside Silas cracked wide open, and suddenly he was remembering the toy horse on the mantel, the daughter who never got to say the word papa, the future that had been stolen before it could begin. He'd thought that chance was gone forever. Had believed he didn't deserve another one. But here was this child, offering him something precious and fragile and utterly unearned, asking nothing in return except the permission to love him. "Yes," he whispered, the word barely audible. "Yes, you can call me that." Clara's face lit up like the sun breaking through storm clouds. "Really? You mean it?" "I mean it." "Can Ben call you that too?" "If he wants to." "And will you marry Nora? Because if you're our papa, you should marry our sister, and then we'd be a real family, and—" "Clara." He stopped her before the words could tumble into territory he wasn't ready to navigate. "One thing at a time, all right?" But the seed she'd planted joined the one Ben had already sown, and together they took root in soil that Silas had thought was beyond cultivation. Walking back to the house with Clara still aboard Daisy, listening to her chatter about all the things they'd do together, all the rides they'd take when she was good enough to go faster, he felt the future reshaping itself around him. Felt the careful plans he'd made, to keep them at arm's length, to let them go come spring, to return to his careful solitude, dissolving like snow in sunshine. But the town had other plans. The following Sunday, Reverend Marcus's sermon was no longer subtle. Ezekiel came back from church with a face like granite and words that fell like blows. "He called you out by name this time," Ezekiel said flatly. Said Silas Gentry was harboring sin under his roof. Said an unmarried man and an unmarried woman living together was an abomination, regardless of the circumstances. Said the children were being exposed to wickedness and corruption. He said that? Silas's voice was dangerously quiet. Called them wicked? Worse. He said they were tainted by their father's sins and would grow up to be the same unless they were removed from your corrupting influence. Ezekiel's jaw worked. Then Thomas Whitmore stood up again. This time, he brought papers. Legal papers. Says Nora Hale owes him $200 now. Interest accumulated, he claims. Says if she can't pay, he's within his rights to seize any property or assets associated with her father's estate. She doesn't have any property or assets. No, but you do. Ezekiel met his eyes. He made it real clear that any gifts given to her, any money spent on her behalf, could be considered assets. Said he'd be watching for evidence of financial transactions between you two. Said if you paid her debt, he'd have grounds to claim she'd essentially sold herself to you. Silas felt rage building in his chest, hot and tight. That's extortion. That's a banker protecting his interests according to the law. Ezekiel's expression was grim. And there's more. The preacher suggested that the children might need to be placed with a proper Christian family. Said there were plenty of good folks in town willing to take in orphans, separate them if necessary to ensure they were properly raised. Like hell. The words came out low and lethal. Like hell, anyone's taking those children. Then you better figure out how to stop them, Ezekiel said. Because this is just the beginning. They're coming for you, Silas. Coming for all of you. And they won't stop until they've either driven you out or destroyed what you're trying to build here. After Ezekiel left, Silas stood in his parlor and stared at the toy horse on the mantel. The last time the town had come for him, he'd hidden. He'd been in a saloon drinking away his fear while his wife died alone. He'd let cowardice rule him, and it had cost him everything. He wouldn't make that mistake again. But when he turned to find Nora, she was already standing in the doorway, her face pale and set with terrible determination. I heard, she said quietly, we're leaving, today, before this gets worse. No. Silas, no. He moved toward her, and she held her ground, though he could see the fear in her eyes. I let people die once because I was too afraid to fight for them. I won't do it again. This isn't your fight. The hell it isn't. His voice rose despite his best efforts to control it. You think I don't know what will happen if you leave? You think I don't know that winter will kill you, that you'll never make it to Helena, that those children will die on some frozen road, and it'll be my fault for letting you go? It won't be your fault. It will be, just like Mary was my fault, just like Lily was my fault, because I knew better, and I let fear make my choices for me. He grabbed her shoulders, not roughly but firmly, forcing her to look at him. I'm done being afraid, Nora. I'm done letting good things slip away because I'm too much of a coward to fight for them. What are you saying? Her voice was barely a whisper. I'm saying you stay. I'm saying we face this together. I'm saying... He stopped, the words catching in his throat, but her eyes held his, and he found the courage to continue. I'm saying I don't want you to leave. Not in the spring. Not ever. Silas? She said his name like a prayer and a warning all at once. I'm 17 years old. You're, what, 30, 31? People will say terrible things. They already are. Let them. You don't understand. In the last town, after Papa died, the things they said about me... Her voice broke. They said I was his whore. Said that's how he paid his debts, by selling his daughter. It wasn't true, but it didn't matter. Truth doesn't matter when people want to believe the worst. Then we'll give them something else to believe. He gentled his grip on her shoulders, his thumbs tracing small circles against the fabric of her dress. We'll get married. Properly. With the whole town as witnesses. That'll shut them up. She stared at him like he'd lost his mind. You can't be serious. I've never been more serious about anything in my life. You don't love me. The words came out flat, defensive. You barely know me. This is just... You're trying to protect us, and I appreciate it, but don't tell me what I feel. He released her shoulders but didn't step back. You think I haven't noticed the way my heart beats faster when you walk into a room? You think I don't see you in every corner of this house, Don't imagine you there when you're not. You think I haven't been lying awake at night trying to figure out how to ask you to stay without sounding like every other desperate man who's tried to use you? Nora's eyes had gone wide, her breath coming faster. Silas, I'm not asking you to love me back, he continued, the words pouring out now like water through a broken dam. I'm not asking for anything except the chance to keep you safe, to give those children a home, to be the man I should have been 5 years ago when it mattered. This isn't about Mary, Nora said softly. This can't be about making up for the past. It's not. He reached up, tucked a strand of hair behind her ear with fingers that trembled slightly. It's about the future. About choosing to live instead of just surviving. About being brave enough to try again. She caught his hand, held it against her cheek. Her skin was warm and soft, and he could feel her pulse racing beneath his fingers. What if I can't be what you need? What if I'm too young, too damaged, too— You're perfect. The word came out fierce and certain. Exactly as you are. Perfect. For a long moment they stood there, the morning light streaming through the window, the house quiet around them except for the distant sounds of the children playing in the bedroom. Then Nora rose on her toes and kissed him, brief, chaste, but full of promise. Ask me properly, she whispered against his lips. If you mean it, ask me properly. Silas pulled back just enough to meet her eyes, and what he saw there made his breath catch. Not just acceptance or resignation, but something that looked dangerously close to hope, to joy, to the beginning of love. He dropped to one knee right there in the parlor, still holding her hand. Nora Hale, will you marry me? Will you let me be a father to your siblings and a husband to you? Will you stay here and build a life with me for however long we both shall live? Yes. The word came out breathless, happy. Yes, you impossible, stubborn, wonderful man. Yes. He stood and pulled her into his arms, and she came willingly, burying her face against his chest. He could feel her shaking, with laughter or tears or relief. He couldn't tell. But it didn't matter. She was here. She was his. They had a chance. We'll do it soon, he said into her hair. Before the town can mount more attacks, before they can separate you from the children or come after you for debts. We'll get married and make it legal and permanent, and then let them try to tear us apart. They will try, she warned, pulling back to look at him. The preacher won't want to marry us. The town won't accept it. This won't be easy. Nothing worth having ever is. But he smiled, and it felt strange on his face. He couldn't remember the last time he'd smiled like this, open and genuine. But we'll face it together. That's more than I've had in a long time. The children found them like that, standing together in the parlor, Nora's hand in Silas's. Clara took one look at their faces and squealed with delight. You're getting married. I knew it. Ben, I told you. Ben appeared behind his sister, his expression cautious but hopeful. Does this mean we get to stay? For real? For real, Silas confirmed, and found himself kneeling again so he could look both children in the eyes. If you'll have me, I'm not your father, and I won't try to replace him. But I'd like to be your family. I'd like to be your papa, if you'll let me. Ben launched himself at Silas with enough force to nearly knock him over, small arms wrapping tight around his neck. I'll let you. I want you to be our papa. I want us to stay forever. Clara joined the embrace, and then Nora, until all four of them were tangled together on the parlor floor, laughing and crying and holding on like they'd never let go. And in that moment, Silas felt something he hadn't felt in 5 years. Complete. Whole. Like all the broken pieces of his life had finally found a way to fit back together into something new and beautiful and worth fighting for. But the fight came sooner than any of them expected. 2 days later, on a cold Tuesday morning, Sheriff Dale arrived with Thomas Whitmore and 2 men Silas didn't recognize. They rode up to the house with grim faces and legal papers, and Silas met them on the porch with his rifle cradled in his arms. That's far enough, he called out. State your business. We're here on legal matters, Sheriff Dale said, though he looked uncomfortable. Thomas has papers. I don't care about papers. Silas's voice was flat and hard. You're not taking those children. You're not touching Nora. And if you try, we'll have a problem. Now, Silas, don't do anything foolish, the sheriff said, raising his hands placatingly. Nobody's trying to take anyone. We just need to discuss the matter of debts and proper guardianship. The only guardianship those children need is mine. As of yesterday, I formally filed papers in town. Adoption papers for both Clara and Benjamin Hale. They're my legal responsibility now. This was a lie. He hadn't had time to file anything yet, but it bought him a moment as the men exchanged confused glances. You can't just adopt children, Whitmore sputtered. There are procedures, laws, and I'm following them, which means until those papers are processed, those children are under my protection. You want to challenge that? You take it up with a judge. Silas shifted the rifle slightly, not quite aiming but making his position clear. As for the debt, I'm settling it. Right now. Full amount, whatever you claim she owes. I already told you what would happen if you paid her debts, Whitmore said, his voice taking on a nasty edge. It'll prove she's been living as your mistress, selling herself to you for room and board. She's been living as my fiancé, Silas interrupted coldly. We're getting married this Sunday, so whatever ugly stories you've been spreading, you can take them and choke on them. The sheriff's eyebrows rose. Married? Does Reverend Marcus know about this? Don't need Marcus. Ezekiel's got the authority to perform marriages. He's a registered minister, has been for years. He'll do the ceremony here, on my land, with whoever wants to witness it. This was only partially true. Ezekiel had the legal right but had never exercised it, but Silas was banking on the town not knowing that detail. This is highly irregular, one of the unknown men said. He had the look of a lawyer about him, all sharp eyes and sharper words. A marriage of convenience to avoid legal consequences. Nothing convenient about it, Silas said. I love her. She's agreed to be my wife. The children will be mine legally. That's not convenience, that's family. Now, unless you've got actual legal grounds to be here, I suggest you leave before I decide you're trespassing. The standoff lasted another tense minute before Sheriff Dale sighed and turned his horse. Come on, boys. We'll take this to the territorial judge. Let him sort it out proper. Whitmore looked like he wanted to argue, but the lawyer placed a hand on his arm and shook his head. They rode off, but not before Whitmore called back. This isn't over, Gentry, not by a long shot. Silas watched them disappear down the road before his legs gave out, and he sat heavily on the porch steps, his hands shaking. The rifle fell from his nerveless fingers, and he had to take several deep breaths before the world stopped spinning. The door opened behind him, and Nora sat down beside him, not touching but close enough that he could feel her warmth. That was terrifying, she said quietly. Yeah. Were you really going to shoot them? If they tried to take you, yes. He looked at her, saw his own fear reflected in her eyes. I meant what I said, Nora. All of it. But I should have asked if you minded me telling them we're engaged. Should have given you time to... I don't mind. She took his hand, laced her fingers through his. And I meant what I said, too. I'll marry you this Sunday or any day you want. Sunday might be soon, he admitted. I don't even know if Ezekiel can really marry us. I might have just lied through my teeth to the sheriff. Then we'll make it true. She squeezed his hand. We'll ask him today. And if he can't, we'll find someone who can. We'll make this work, Silas, whatever it takes. He pulled her close, tucked her against his side, and together they watched the sun climb higher in the clear winter sky. Somewhere in the distance, they could hear Clara teaching Ben a song their mother had taught them. The sound was pure and sweet, and it carried on the cold air like a promise. That evening, Ezekiel came for dinner and listened quietly as Silas explained what had happened, what he'd claimed, what he needed. You want me to marry you and Miss Nora, Ezekiel said slowly. This Sunday, in front of witnesses. Yes. You know I ain't never performed a marriage before. I got the certificate, sure, but you're legally authorized. That's all that matters. Ezekiel studied them both, his dark eyes seeing too much. This about beating the town? About protecting these children? It's about all of that, Silas admitted. But it's also about... He glanced at Nora, saw her encouraging nod. It's about choosing life. About being brave enough to try again. About finding something worth fighting for. And Miss Nora? You sure about this? Because marriage ain't something you can undo if it don't work out. Once it's done, it's done. I'm sure, Nora said firmly. Silas is... She paused, searching for words. He's the first good thing that's happened to us in a long time. Maybe ever. I trust him. She took a breath. I think I could love him. I think maybe I already do. The words hit Silas like a physical blow, stealing his breath. She'd said she'd marry him, said she'd stay, but this was more than he'd hoped for, more than he'd dared to imagine. Well then. Ezekiel's serious expression broke into a rare smile. Guess I better dust off my Bible and practice my preacher voice. Sunday it is. The next few days passed in a blur of preparation. Nora had no dress suitable for a wedding, so Silas rode to town and bought fabric, cream-colored wool that would be practical and warm, but still beautiful. Mrs. Henderson from the neighboring ranch came to help with the sewing, taking Nora's measurements with gentle efficiency and asking no questions about the sudden wedding. About time this house had some joy in it, was all she said, and patted Silas's hand with her weathered one. Clara and Ben helped clean the house until it gleamed, chattering constantly about the wedding, about their new papa, about all the things they'd do as a family. Their excitement was infectious, and Silas found himself caught up in it despite his nervousness. Because underneath the practicality and the legal necessity, this was real. He was marrying Nora Hale. He was becoming a father to 2 children who'd claimed his heart when he wasn't looking. He was choosing to live again, to risk again, to believe that maybe happiness wasn't something that had died with Mary, but something that could be rebuilt from the ashes of grief. The night before the wedding, Nora found him in the barn checking on the horses. She'd wrapped herself in one of his old coats, and in the lantern light she looked young and uncertain. Having second thoughts? He asked gently. No, you? Terrified, he admitted. But not having second thoughts. Never that. She moved closer, and he opened his arms automatically. She fitted against him perfectly, her head tucked under his chin. Silas, after we're married, she paused, and he could feel her tension. I know men have expectations, marital rights and such, and I'll honor them. But I've never... Nora, he pulled back so he could see her face. I'm not marrying you for that. I'm marrying you because I want you in my life, because I want to keep you and the children safe, because... He cupped her face gently. Because you make me believe in futures again. That's enough. More than enough. Anything else can wait until you're ready. Years if necessary. I'm a patient man. Her eyes filled with tears. How are you real? How is any of this real? I don't know, he said honestly. But I'm grateful for it. For you. For all of this. She kissed him then, properly this time, not the brief press of lips from before, but something deeper, searching, full of promise and question all at once. When she pulled away, they were both breathing hard. Tomorrow, she whispered. Tomorrow, I'll be your wife. Tomorrow, he agreed, and every day after. They stood together in the barn, surrounded by the quiet sounds of horses and the smell of hay and leather, and Silas felt something settle in his chest, a rightness, a certainty that he was exactly where he was supposed to be, whatever came next. Whatever the town threw at them, whatever challenges they'd face it together. That was more than he'd had in 5 years. That was everything. Sunday morning dawned clear and cold, the kind of Montana winter day that hurt to breathe but sparkled like the world had been dipped in diamonds. Silas woke before first light, his heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and terror that felt remarkably similar to the morning he'd married Mary. But this was different. Everything about this was different. He found Ezekiel already in the kitchen, building up the fire and setting coffee to brew. The older man looked up with a slight smile. Couldn't sleep either? Ezekiel asked. Haven't slept in 2 days. Silas ran his hands through his hair. Keep thinking something's going to go wrong, that the town will show up with more papers, or the territorial judge, or maybe nothing goes wrong, Ezekiel interrupted gently. Maybe today is just a good day. You ever consider that possibility? Silas hadn't, actually. He'd spent so long expecting disaster that the concept of things simply working out felt foreign, almost dangerous to hope for. I've been thinking about what to say, Ezekiel continued, pulling out a worn Bible. For the ceremony. Traditional words seem right, but I thought I might add something. About second chances. About how love isn't always lightning strikes and poetry. Sometimes it's just choosing each other every day, especially on the hard days. That sounds good, Silas said roughly. That sounds right. They drank their coffee in companionable silence as the house slowly came alive around them. Clara appeared first, practically vibrating with excitement, her hair already braided with ribbons that Mrs. Henderson must have brought. Ben followed, dressed in clothes Silas had bought him in town, looking older somehow in the clean shirt and proper trousers. Is it time yet? Clara asked for the dozenth time. Can we see Nora? Not yet, Silas told her. Bride's supposed to have time to get ready without everyone watching. That's silly. We've seen her get dressed a million times. Well, today's special. Today she gets privacy. He ruffled her hair, earning a squeal of protest about messing up the ribbons. Mrs. Henderson emerged from the bedroom where she'd been helping Nora, and her eyes were suspiciously bright. She's ready, she announced. And Silas Gentry, if you don't treat that girl like the blessing she is, I'll take a switch to you myself, grown man or not. Yes, ma'am, Silas managed, his throat suddenly tight. The ceremony was to take place in the parlor, in front of the fireplace with its mantel that now held both the toy horse and a small bouquet of dried wildflowers Clara had insisted on arranging. It wasn't grand or fancy, but as people began to arrive, Mrs. Henderson and her husband, a few neighboring ranchers who'd always been decent to Silas, even old Doc Hartwell who'd ridden out despite the cold, the room filled with warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. Noticeably absent were Reverend Marcus, Thomas Whitmore, and anyone else from the town's so-called leadership. Their absence was its own statement, but Silas found he didn't care. The people who mattered were here. The people who understood what family meant, what loyalty meant, what love meant. They'd come to witness and celebrate. When Nora finally appeared in the doorway, Silas forgot how to breathe. Mrs. Henderson had worked magic with the cream wool, fashioning a dress that was simple but elegant, fitted at the bodice and flowing to the floor. Nora had left her hair loose, the way Silas had once mentioned he liked it, and it fell in dark waves past her shoulders. She held a small bouquet of evergreen sprigs, practical, winter-hardy, enduring. Her eyes found his across the room, and the nervous uncertainty in them transformed into something radiant when she saw his expression. She was 17 years old and had lived more hardship than most people experienced in a lifetime. She was fierce and frightened, brave and broken, stubborn and soft all at once, and she was walking toward him with steady steps, her hand light on Ben's arm as the boy proudly escorted his sister down the makeshift aisle. When she reached him, Silas took her hand and found it trembling. He squeezed gently, a silent promise. I've got you. We've got each other. Ezekiel opened his Bible and cleared his throat, and the room fell silent except for the crackle of the fire and Clara's excited breathing. We're gathered here today, Ezekiel began, his deep voice filling the space with unexpected authority, to witness the union of Silas Gentry and Nora Hale. Now, I could stand here and recite all the traditional words about marriage, and I will, because the law requires it, but first I want to say something that matters more. He looked at both of them, his gaze steady and knowing. I've known Silas for 5 years. Watched him bury himself along with his wife and child. Watched him turn this house into a tomb and his heart into stone. I didn't think I'd ever see him live again, truly live, not just exist. But then 3 strangers showed up asking for shelter, and something happened that I can only call a miracle. Nora's eyes were bright with unshed tears. Silas's hand tightened on hers. Marriage isn't just about love, Ezekiel continued, though that helps, and I believe what you two have could grow into something deep and lasting. Marriage is about choosing someone, about saying, I see who you are, the broken parts and the beautiful parts, and I choose to stand beside you anyway. It's about building something together out of whatever materials you've got, even if those materials are just hope and determination and stubborn refusal to give up. He smiled then, warm and genuine. Silas Gentry, you're choosing to be a husband again and a father for the first time. Nora Hale, you're choosing to trust a man when you've had every reason not to trust any man ever again. These children are choosing to open their hearts to new family. That kind of bravery deserves to be witnessed and celebrated. Clara sniffled loudly, and someone passed her a handkerchief. "Now then," Ezekiel said, his tone shifting to something more formal. "Silas Gentry, do you take Nora Hale to be your lawfully wedded wife? Do you promise to honor her, protect her, stand beside her in times of plenty and times of want, in sickness and in health, for as long as you both shall live?" "I do." The words came out strong and certain, and Silas meant them with every fiber of his being. "Nora Hale, do you take Silas Gentry to be your lawfully wedded husband? Do you promise to honor him, stand beside him, build a life with him, in times of plenty and times of want, in sickness and in health, for as long as you both shall live?" Nora's voice wavered only slightly. "I do." "The rings?" There was a moment of panic. They'd been so focused on the legal aspects and the speed of everything that rings hadn't even occurred to Silas. But Ben stepped forward, his small hand outstretched, holding two simple bands that gleamed dully in the firelight. "I made them," the boy announced proudly, "out of copper wire. Papa—" He stopped, his face flushing. Silas showed me how to twist them just right so they wouldn't break. They're not fancy, but they're perfect," Nora said, her voice breaking. "Ben, they're absolutely perfect." Silas took the slightly larger band and slipped it onto Nora's finger, his hand surprisingly steady. "With this ring, I thee wed." Nora took the smaller band and placed it on his finger, and the copper was warm from Ben's pocket. "With this ring, I thee wed." "Then by the power vested in me by the Montana Territory," Ezekiel said, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. Silas, you may kiss your bride." Silas cupped Nora's face in his hands, gentle and reverent, and kissed her softly. It was brief and chaste, aware of the watching children and neighbors, but it held a promise of more to come, of years stretching ahead, of choosing each other again and again. When they pulled apart, Clara was already launching herself at both of them, wrapping her arms around their waists. Ben joined the embrace more cautiously, and then they were all tangled together, a new family forged from loss and courage, and the simple decision to open a barn door on a snowy night. The celebration that followed was modest but joyful. Mrs. Henderson had brought food, and somehow the table was laden with more than Silas had seen in years. There was music. Doc Hartwell played a surprisingly competent fiddle, and even some dancing, though Silas was rusty and kept stepping on Nora's feet until she laughed and told him she didn't mind. "You'll have years to practice," she said, her arms around his neck as they swayed to the music. "We have time now, all the time in the world." But even as the words left her mouth, there was a commotion outside. The music stopped. The laughter died. Through the window, Silas could see riders approaching, more than before, perhaps a dozen, and at their head rode Reverend Marcus and Thomas Whitmore, with Sheriff Dale looking distinctly uncomfortable behind them. "Stay here," Silas told Nora, already moving toward the door. "Like hell," she replied, following him. "We're married now. That means we face things together." He wanted to argue, wanted to protect her from whatever ugliness was coming, but the determination in her eyes stopped him. She was right. They were partners now. Whatever came next, they'd handle it side by side. The crowd on his porch had grown as his guests came out to see what was happening. Ezekiel positioned himself at Silas's right, and Doc Hartwell moved to his left, and suddenly there was a wall of people between the riders and the house. "This wedding is illegal," Reverend Marcus announced without preamble. "Performed by an unauthorized minister." "I'm authorized," Ezekiel said calmly. "Have been for 15 years. Got the certificate from the territorial government if you want to see it." Marcus's face darkened. "The girl is underage. 17 is legal marriage age in Montana Territory with parental consent," Doc Hartwell interrupted. "And as there are no living parents, and as Silas has formally filed for guardianship of her siblings, making him legally responsible for the family unit, he could be considered to stand in loco parentis." "That's a stretch of the law," the Reverend sputtered. "Maybe," the doctor agreed pleasantly. "But it'll hold up in court. I know the territorial judge personally. Good man, fair man. He won't look kindly on attempts to break up a legal marriage, especially one contracted to keep a family together." Thomas Whitmore pushed forward. "What about the debts? The girl's father owed—" "Here," Silas pulled a paper from his pocket and held it up. Bill of sale. Paid in full this morning before the wedding. $200 cash for all debts associated with Thomas Hale. Deceased. Your associate, he nodded toward one of the men in the back, was happy to accept payment and sign off on the debt being satisfied. Whitmore's face went purple. Burton, you idiot! You said to collect the debt, Burton protested. He paid it. What was I supposed to do? Refuse money? The crowd of townspeople began to mutter among themselves. Silas could see the calculation happening. They'd come expecting to intimidate, to threaten, to force compliance. Instead, they were facing legal documents and a united front. This isn't over, Reverend Marcus said, his voice tight with fury. The church will not recognize this union. We will not— Don't need the church's recognition, Silas said flatly. Got the territories, which is all that matters legally. You want to exclude us from your services, your socials, your moral superiority? That's your choice. But you don't get to tell us how to live. You don't get to separate this family. And you sure as hell don't get to stand on my land and tell me who I can and can't marry. You're making a mockery of Christian values. No, a new voice interrupted. Old Mrs. Doyle pushed her way through the crowd, leaning heavily on her cane. She was ancient, had to be pushing 80, and she'd lived in the territory longer than anyone. Her word carried weight. You're making a mockery of Christian values, Marcus. This man took in orphans when they needed shelter, fed them when they were starving, cared for them when they were sick. And now he's making them legal family, giving them his name and his protection. That's what Christ actually taught, not your rules about propriety and appearance. Margaret, the Reverend started. Don't you Margaret me, she snapped. I've known you since you were in short pants, and I'm not impressed by your fancy theological education. These children needed help, and Silas Gentry provided it. If that offends your delicate sensibilities, that says more about you than it does about him. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd, not from everyone, but from enough people that the balance of power shifted visibly. Silas felt Nora's hand slip into his, felt her lean against his side, and drew strength from her presence. I'll be plain, Silas said into the uncertain silence. My wife and I— He let the words hang there, claiming them— are building a life here. We're raising these children as our own. We'll work hard, pay our debts, and mind our own business. We're not asking for the town's blessing or approval. We're just asking to be left in peace. And if we refuse, Whitmore challenged, if we make it clear you're not welcome in town, that your business isn't wanted, then we'll manage without you, Nora said, her voice clear and strong. She stepped forward, and Silas felt pride surge through him at her courage. We don't need much. We have land, livestock, and each other. We'll grow our own food, make our own clothes, trade with neighbors who don't judge us. We survived worse than your disapproval, Mr. Whitmore. We'll survive this too. Well said, Mrs. Henderson called out. And you can count on us as neighbors. Some of us still remember what community actually means. Amen to that, someone else added, and then several others until nearly half the crowd was nodding agreement, while the other half looked uncertain. Sheriff Dale finally spoke, his voice carrying authority. Seems to me this is all legal and proper. Man has a right to marry who he chooses. Woman agreed of her own free will. I heard her say, I do myself. Children are being cared for in a stable home. Don't see what business it is of anyone else's. He turned his horse. I'm heading back to town. Anyone who wants to keep causing trouble can explain to the territorial judge why they're harassing law-abiding citizens. The threat was clear. Several of the riders exchanged glances and began to turn their horses. Reverend Marcus looked like he wanted to continue the fight, but even he could see he'd lost this round. With a final glare that promised this wasn't over, he wheeled his horse and galloped off, Whitmore close behind. As the crowd dispersed, some angry, some thoughtful, some openly supportive, Silas felt the tension drain from his body. They'd faced the town's judgment and survived. They'd stood their ground and won, at least for today. That was terrifying, Nora whispered. That was incredible, he corrected. You were incredible. We were incredible, she amended with a small smile. Together. The guests filtered back inside, the celebration resuming with renewed energy. There was a sense of triumph now, of having weathered a storm and come through stronger. Clara and Ben were passed from person to person, hugged and congratulated, and promised presents that would arrive later. Nora was embraced by Mrs. Henderson and Mrs. Doyle, welcomed into the community of women who understood what it meant to survive and endure. As evening fell and the guests began to depart, each one stopping to shake Silas's hand or kiss Nora's cheek, the house gradually emptied until it was just the four of them again. Family, in every way that mattered. Clara and Ben were exhausted, practically asleep on their feet. Nora guided them to bed, and Silas listened to her soft voice reading them a story, the words drifting through the house like music. When she finally emerged, closing the bedroom door softly behind her, he was waiting in the parlor with 2 cups of tea. "I don't know what happens now," she admitted, sitting beside him on the old sofa. "Being married, being a mother to Clara and Ben, being—" she gestured vaguely. "All of this." "Neither do I," Silas said honestly, "but I figure we'll learn together, make mistakes together, figure it out as we go. What if I'm terrible at it? What if I can't be what they need?" "You've kept them alive against impossible odds," he reminded her. "You've shown them love and courage and determination. That's what they need. That's what we all need." She leaned against him and he wrapped his arm around her shoulders, marveling at how natural it felt, how right. "Silas, do you really think this can work? Not just the legal parts, but us?" "I think," he said slowly, choosing his words carefully, "that I spent 5 years convinced I was done living, that my chance at happiness died with Mary. But then you showed up asking for barn space, and something in me started breathing again. So yes, I think this can work. I think maybe we can be happy, if we're brave enough to try." "I'm scared," she admitted. "Me too. But I'd rather be scared with you than safe alone." She tilted her head up and he kissed her, deeper this time, more certain, a promise and a question all at once. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, she was smiling. "We should probably figure out the sleeping arrangements," she said, a slight flush coloring her cheeks. "I know we're married, but—" "No rush," he assured her. "We have time. All the time we need. For now, you keep the room with the children. I'll stay in mine. When you're ready for more, you let me know. Until then, we just keep learning each other." The relief in her eyes made his chest ache. "Thank you for understanding. Thank you for taking a chance on a broken-down rancher with more ghosts than sense." She laughed, the sound bright and genuine, and Silas realized it was the first time he'd heard her laugh like that. Uninhibited, joyful, free. He wanted to spend the rest of his life creating moments that made her laugh like that. The winter months that followed were hard, but good. Word of the confrontation spread, and the town remained divided. Some refused to do business with Silas, while others made a point of being extra friendly, as if to compensate. The territorial judge did eventually review the adoption papers and the marriage certificate, and he declared both legal and binding, much to Reverend Marcus's obvious displeasure. Spring came slowly, the snow melting in fits and starts, revealing the land beneath. Silas taught Ben to help with the calving, and the boy proved to have a natural touch with the animals. Clara learned to ride properly, graduating from walking circles in the yard to short trots across the meadow. Nora planted the garden she'd planned all winter, and Silas built her raised beds and a small greenhouse to extend the growing season. They fell into rhythms and routines, learned each other's habits and preferences, argued about small things and laughed about smaller ones. Silas taught Nora to shoot, and she taught him to read poetry without feeling foolish. The children flourished with regular meals and consistent love, growing taller and stronger and more confident. And slowly, carefully, Silas and Nora grew closer. It started with lingering touches, hands brushing while washing dishes, shoulders pressed together while reading, brief kisses that gradually became longer, deeper. 3 months after the wedding, Nora moved into his room, her belongings gradually migrating until the space that had been his alone became theirs together. Their first night truly as husband and wife was gentle and awkward and sweet, full of whispered reassurances and soft laughter, and the kind of tenderness that came from choosing each other every day. Afterwards, lying tangled together in the darkness, Nora traced patterns on his chest and whispered, "I love you. I should have said it before, but I was scared. I love you, Silas Gentry." "I love you too," he replied, the words coming easier than he'd expected. I think I have since you stood in my barn and refused to accept charity. She laughed softly. I was so stubborn. You still are. It's one of my favorite things about you. As spring turned to summer, life continued to unfold in ways both expected and surprising. Ben caught his first fish and was so proud he made them all come see it before he'd agree to clean it. Clara learned to read fluently and began teaching children from neighboring ranches, displaying a natural gift for patience and instruction. Nora discovered she was pregnant in late July, and the news was greeted with shrieks of joy from Clara and solemn promises from Ben to be the best big brother ever. Silas felt fear at the news. How could he not, with his history? But it was tempered by something stronger, hope. This time would be different. This time he wouldn't run. This time he'd be there, present and accounted for, no matter how scared he got. The pregnancy progressed without complication, and on a cold February morning with snow falling soft outside the window, Nora gave birth to a healthy baby girl. Doc Hartwell attended, and Mrs. Henderson, and when the baby's first cry filled the house, Silas felt something he'd thought was impossible. He felt the past and present come together without pain. What should we name her? Nora asked, exhausted but glowing, the baby cradled against her chest. Silas looked at his daughter, pink and perfect and alive, so wonderfully alive, and felt tears stream down his face unchecked. Rose, he said, for new beginnings. Rose Lily, Nora suggested softly, for new beginnings and old memories both. He nodded, unable to speak, and gathered his wife and daughter into his arms. Clara and Ben crept into the room, having been waiting impatiently outside, and they all crowded onto the bed together. A family built from pieces, stitched together with courage and choice and love. That evening, after the excitement had died down and the baby was sleeping peacefully in the cradle Silas had built during the long winter nights, he stood on his porch and looked out at his land. The same valley, the same hills, the same barn where it had all started. But everything was different now. Everything was alive. Nora joined him, wrapped in a shawl against the cold, her body still recovering but her spirit strong. What are you thinking about? That night you showed up, he said. When you asked if you could sleep in my barn, I thought I was just letting in strangers. I didn't know I was letting in my whole future. 6 words, she mused. That's all it took. Can we sleep in your barn? Best question anyone ever asked me. He pulled her close, careful of her still tender body. You gave me back my life, Nora. You and those kids. You made me want to live again. You gave us a home, she countered. More than that. You gave us a family. You chose us when you could have turned us away. They stood together in the cold Montana evening, listening to the sounds of their house. Ben's voice reading to Clara, the baby's small snuffles, the crackle of the fire inside. These were the sounds of life, of family, of love chosen and fought for, and built brick by brick from ruins. Somewhere in the darkness, a coyote called to its mate. In the barn, the horses settled for the night. And in the house that had once been a tomb, laughter suddenly erupted as Ben told some joke that made Clara shriek with delight. We should go in, Nora said, before they wake the baby. In a minute. Silas held her a moment longer, committing this feeling to memory, the weight of her against him, the warmth of home behind them, the vast possibility of future stretching ahead. I just want to remember this. Want to hold on to it. We have years to make memories, she reminded him. A whole lifetime of moments just like this one. She was right. They did. And as they turned to go inside to their children, their baby, their life, Silas felt something he hadn't felt in longer than he could remember. Complete and utter peace. The kind that came from knowing exactly where you belonged, exactly who you were meant to be with, exactly what you were fighting for. He'd opened his barn door on a snowy night and 3 strangers had walked through, but they hadn't stayed strangers. They'd become family. They'd become everything. And when Silas Gentry finally closed the door behind them, shutting out the cold and sealing in the warmth, he knew with absolute certainty that he would never be alone again. Never be lost again. Never be just surviving again. Because Nora had asked to sleep in his barn, and instead she'd given him back his home, his heart, his life. And that was worth every moment of fear, every second of doubt, every risk he'd taken to choose love over safety and family over solitude. That was worth everything.